Hi, you're with Truth News Radio Australia. Welcome back. It's great to have you aboard the show today. We are going through some news in relation to Australian affairs that are pretty important. And in the next section here, I want to talk about the Schapelle Corby story. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Schapelle Corby, if you're listening overseas, Schapelle Corby is an Australian citizen who was arrested in Bali in October 2004. She was on her way just for a holiday with her friends and family. And when she went through the customs at Bali's Denpasar airport, she was found to be carrying 4.2 kilograms of marijuana, which was stuffed into a boogie board bag. Now, Schapelle protested her innocence right from the start. Her entire attitude towards it was that this is nothing to do with me. She did not interfere with the customs when they were trying to do the search. She was absolutely shocked when they unzipped the bag and saw what was in there. She asked for fingerprints to be taken of the bag to potentially exonerate her. Of course, they didn't take those fingerprints. She asked for CCTV footage to be presented to the prosecutors in Bali to indicate that her bag, was not stuffed with this massive amount of marijuana, which would have been quite obvious from the security camera footage. She was not granted that footage. They didn't supply it either from Sydney Airport or Brisbane, where she originated, or from Denpasar. She begged them to do forensic testing of the origin of the marijuana that was found on her. They refused to do that. There was never any proof that she had connections with drug syndicates, either in Australia or in Indonesia. There were no other prosecutions in relation to this. It was just Schapelle. The people she was travelling with were never even the subject of an investigation. She was just basically took the rap, and because she continued to protest her innocence, she got the maximum sentence. She got the harshest sentence possible, which was 20 years in Bali's Karabokan prison, which is an absolute, nightmare. It would be very hard to even survive that. The living conditions there are very, very tough. It's very overcrowded, and there's a lot of violence, and there's also a lot of drug dealing in there as well, ironically. Now, over the years, there's been so much information and disinformation coming out about the Schapelle story. But what I really want to focus on today is that what I believe, and many of us now believe, is the reason why Schapelle has been basically denied justice, is that this is a cover-up of the extremely corrupt practices that were known to be going on at major airports around Australia, particularly at Sydney's Kingsford Smith Airport. Now, there were a number of investigations that had been ongoing from early, I think, in 2002, which had shown that baggage handlers and customs officers were actually part of an international drug syndicate, and that these people were facilitating the trafficking of marijuana and heroin and various other drugs through the airports, using passengers' baggage as the transportation mechanism. And this was actually being done from overseas into Australia, and it was also being done domestically. So if you wanted to get a bag of marijuana from Brisbane to Sydney, you'd just get your mates in the baggage handling department to pick it up, and then they would insert it in someone's bag at Brisbane, and then someone at the other end would pull it out, and it was all a smoothly oiled machine, and people would be paid off. And this is how it worked. And most of the time, no one knew the difference. The passengers had no idea it was going on. But, there is always a risk that if you're going to use a passenger as a drug mule unknowingly, that may have repercussions. Now, this is actually not just my opinion. There are some top customs people that have been interviewed on this subject, and you can find all that at a website called expendable.tv. That's the Expendable report on Schapelle Corby, and they've done a tremendous amount of work in uncovering this type of information. And the customs were aware that it was going on, that the non-corrupt people in the department. And when Schapelle was arrested, they had conversations amongst themselves that this was actually probably a case where one of these drug syndicates had screwed up essentially and forgotten to take the drugs out of the bag, and so it went on to Bali. Now, initially, you see, what's really indicative of the level of corruption at the highest levels in our government is that while initially there was support for Schapelle and there was a massive grassroots campaign to free her because it was pretty apparent that she was innocent, the government started to backpedal on it. They gave her initial support, then they started backing off. And around about 3 months after she was arrested, there started to be more of these reports surfacing about the corrupt baggage handlers and police involvement in that, like that there were actually corrupt police involvement as well. Now, at that time, the head of the Australian Federal Police, which I believe was Mick Keelty at that time, said that, actually, I believe he might have been the police commissioner at that time. I'm not sure what his exact role was, but he was a very, obviously, highly ranking figure. And he made a very damaging statement to Schapelle's case, because Schapelle was claiming that this must have been put in there by someone at the airport, because obviously she didn't put it in there, and that's what she insists. She did not put it in there. She checked her bag in. It was in there when she arrived, so someone at the airport must have done it. But Mick Keelty, the senior ranking police commissioner, said on a live interview on television that there was little evidence to suggest that this type of thing was going on, little evidence to suggest that there were these type of corrupt practices, little evidence to suggest that baggage handlers, customs and other corrupt members of the government were facilitating drug transportation. But even as he said those words, there were other police coming forward to say the exact opposite, that he knew full well was the case. And there was the Alan Kessing report, which is the main report from the Customs Department itself, which he also would have known about, which details their investigation, which was a 3-year investigation into the corrupt practices of baggage handlers at Sydney Airport. The statements that were made by government at that time destroyed Schapelle's case, because Schapelle's case was based on this claim that someone else had put it in there. The government refused to give it any support. The Indonesians said, well, if that's the way it is, and the Indonesians work, obviously the diplomatic channels are very important to the government over there. And the position of our government was very important in influencing the position of the prosecutors in Bali. So she was found guilty on the prima facie evidence that the drugs were found in her bag. But there is nothing to connect her with those drugs. There is no forensic. There is no background connection. There is no photographic or other evidence that shows she was carrying that bag full of that material. Unfortunately, she received the harshest sentence, and her appeal was also quashed, and she's now suffering severe mental trauma, mental illness. She's been on heavy antipsychotic and antidepressant medication for a number of years. And we're just getting up now to the news that we have had yesterday, that Schapelle Corby is closer to release, as a new report recommends clemency. Now, this was in the major newspapers yesterday, and it was also on the news and on the radio. However, there are some interesting points to make about it, which I will get into. But first of all, here is the story from yesterday. Convicted drug smuggler Schapelle Corby is a step closer to winning her freedom after Indonesia's Justice Ministry confirmed it had recommended she be granted clemency and an early release. The The development comes 2 years after Corby first launched her bid for clemency. Corby, 34, is suffering from mental illness and struggling to cope with life inside Bali's notorious Karabokan jail. While details of the recommendations from the Justice and Human Rights Ministry have only just emerged, a senior official confirmed the final report was handed down to Indonesian President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono some months ago. And that's the key words there, some months ago. Actually, about 6 months ago. And this is actually not new news. But there is some new news that surfaced just yesterday on the Expendable report, which I'll be getting into straight after the break. It's really important stuff. We'll be back shortly. Hi, welcome back to Truth News Radio Australia. My name's Hereward Fenton. Welcome back to the show. Today I'm going through some of the unfolding issues in the Schapelle Corby case. And I want now to turn to some information which was just published on the Expendable project. That's expendable.tv. Now, this is very complex and very dense information, and I'm going to struggle to get through this because it refers to many different characters, many different threads and many different themes. But there are two names you need to hold in your mind because these two names are of critical importance. One of them is William Miller. William Miller was a man with a police record connected to the drug trade who came forward and did an interview with the Daily Telegraph at some time in 2005. And unfortunately, I don't have the dates here. I wish I did. Actually, I've got one date here, July 27, 2005, I believe is the date he came forward. And this became a big headline in Australian news. The Daily Telegraph headline was, "Corby's drugs were mine." And I'll just read to you here from that story. Actually, it's very hard to read this because I'm looking at an actual scan of a printed page and not a textual block. I'm actually looking at just a graphic, and it's actually impossible for me to read it. In a series of lengthy interviews over 2 days this week, Miller said he wanted to save Corby from a life in jail, but he demanded... sorry, I'm actually reading the wrong part of this story. This is actually quite a long story, and I've actually just scrolled it to the wrong point. Just to give you a background here, the story was put into the Daily Telegraph. The headline of the story was, "Corby's drugs were mine." The second half of the story was then more or less a hit piece on the man who gave the interview, saying that he was demanding money for the story. And that in itself is another story, ladies and gentlemen, because it's the story of the Daily Telegraph character assassinating the man who actually came forward to give the story in the first place. I'll just read to you from the summary provided at the Expendable report. On the face of it, the story was potentially helpful to Schapelle Corby. The Daily Telegraph presented Mr. Miller as an important figure in the case, in its front page exclusive, yet towards the end it almost dismissed its own story. Unfortunately, I'm not able to give you that information because it's actually not here on the page in front of me. I'll just try and summarize it for you. The man who came forward had said that he was involved in a drug operation and that he was actually asked to go and pick up some drugs from Sydney Airport on the same dates that Schapelle Corby was flying out of Sydney to Denpasar Airport. Now, he actually says he declined the job, but he came forward with this information because the dates matched and he had a background in this type of operation, and he was convinced that these drugs that he was meant to be picking up were actually Schapelle Corby's, the ones that ended up in Schapelle Corby's bag. Now, the next character you need to bear in mind in this story is Chris Laycock. Now, there is a whole lot of information on Chris Laycock in the news, in the media. You can put it into Google. He is a corrupt police officer who was found to have engaged in standover tactics, extortion, and had connections with drug dealers. Now, it turns out that Chris Laycock had direct connections with the man in this story who says Corby's drugs were mine. And this is why it is so important. But the reason why I'm telling you this now, and the reason why this was not known years ago, because this is all from 2005, is because it was completely suppressed. Because the information that would have provided that to the general public was brought up in a closed hearing at the Sydney Crime Commission. And the Sydney Crime Commission was obviously a watchdog that was set up to oversee and to look into matters of corruption within the police. And I'm just actually scrolling through here an incredibly dense document that's actually a PDF file that's on Google Docs that has all of this. But this is why it's actually very difficult for me to present this information to you, because I'm actually trying to, I've got a document that's hundreds of thousands of words long, and it's got different segments in it that have very pertinent bits of information, and it would take me probably 3 hours to go through the whole lot. So I'm just going to actually read to you here the key point, which I think is really the killer point in this whole issue. And this is from the confidential minutes of the Gaimea team meeting of the Crime Commission, which have now been leaked to the Expendable project. In July and August of 2005, Gaimea investigators released LD material, and I'm going to explain all the abbreviations after. Investigators released LD material possibly related to the Corby drug trial prosecution. The information from a recorded conversation between Gaimea POI John Dunks and William Moss, William Moss is a pseudonym for William Miller. Sorry, this is complex. William Moss equals William Miller. Indicated that Moss was awaiting a shipment of cannabis from Queensland that was to be smuggled through Sydney Airport about October 2004, when the Corby cannabis seizure occurred. Moss alleged to press during the Corby investigation that he was the intended recipient of the Corby cannabis. The LD conversation supported this assertion. This matter has been followed up with Warren Gray from the AFP. Now let's just break down that paragraph for you. In July 2005, Gaimea investigators released LD material possibly relevant to the Corby Bali drug prosecution. LD means listening device, meaning that this material was procured via the bugging of a suspect location, which is understood to be Dunk's home. The information arising from a recorded conversation between Gaimea POI, person of interest, John Dunks, and William Moss indicated that Moss was awaiting a shipment of cannabis from Queensland that was to be smuggled through Sydney Airport. Dunks is the very person who William Miller cited as offering the airport collection job. He is also positioned by the Cobalt Report to be an important key member of the Laycock Hopes gang. The recording indicated that William Miller was awaiting a shipment of marijuana, suggesting that the shipment was yet to occur. In other words, it suggests that the recording was made prior to the event itself. The Cobalt Report also confirms that Dunks was a person of interest prior to the 8th of October 2004, when the public hearing commenced. And this was, ironically and incredibly, this was the very same date on which Schapelle Corby flew to Bali. A New South Wales Crime Commission hearing to which William Moss was called also confirmed the contents of the recording. This was a private conversation between William Miller and the person he stated had given him the airport job, in which they discuss that very collection. Now, as I mentioned earlier, William Miller's story was discredited. It was even discredited in the story that presented it in the Daily Telegraph. As I mentioned there, they made a big deal that he demanded money for it. And on the ABC Media Watch, they completely trashed him. And the Media Watch program is being and continues to be used as a tool of government propaganda. It is not a media watchdog. It is merely a tool to manipulate what people think. And the Media Watch program did a terrific job of destroying the credibility of this man, William Miller, who we now know from this secret, confidential, leaked information was genuinely involved in this operation, and everything he says is corroborated, right? It all matches up. This would have been a gold mine for Schapelle Corby's defence. This would have got her off, ladies and gentlemen. This would have had Schapelle released. There's no doubt about it. And we've got to add that to all the other information that we already knew, right? Which is the ongoing corruption in the airports. And let me just go through some of the other things that I haven't mentioned in this show. There was another operation which was called Operation Mocha, which the Australian Federal Police were involved in, that was tracking a drug syndicate that was bringing drugs from Argentina. Or was it Peru? It was definitely from somewhere in South America. Now, they were overseeing this operation. They were monitoring it, okay? And drugs were being brought in, cocaine in this case, was being brought in from South America. And the day in which the main transport of those drugs came through Sydney Airport was the very same day, the 8th of October, that Schapelle flew to Bali. The very same day when this public hearing was commenced, the very same day that we had all of this information coinciding in the police about what was going on with this very pervasive network of drug couriers connected to airport people, connected to corrupt customs officers. We have senior government members denying it after the event in 2005. We have Mick Kilty completely denying it, but we have evidence from within the police that they were monitoring it, they were aware of it, they even had recordings of people talking about it. It's a travesty of justice for Schapelle Corby, of course, and she's paid an unbelievable price for this cover-up. She has actually facilitated the cover-up of these corrupt officials and facilitated that the general public remains unaware of complete breaches of law that were ongoing and one must presume are continuing in the system since they haven't been fully exposed. Now, of course, Schapelle's plea for clemency may come through, but that appears to be a cover story. That appears to be a smokescreen and a distraction from this really, really bombshell evidence. So please go to expendable.tv, check it out. We're just going to break now. It's great to have your company. I'll be back after the break.